everyone. Hello, everyone who's in the room with us and everybody who is watching this event online, either on the Martin Center YouTube channel or on the Martin Center website. This event today is about the vexatious issue of instrumentalization of migration. Our seminar will last 60 minutes. After a brief presentation of the paper that we are launching today, you can have a copy at the table there in the reception area. We'll hear comments from two speakers who are with us today as well. And then there'll be a discussion inside the panel, and in the second half, I will open the floor to you and also to you who are with us virtually. My name is Vít Novotný. I'll be your moderator. I will first introduce our speakers. Vladimír Šimoniák, the author of the study. Contrary to what the program says, he has a brand new job as a state secretary at the Ministry of the Economy of Slovakia. Lena Dupont is a member of the European Parliament for the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and also a shadow rapporteur for the instrumentalization regulation, a bill which is currently being debated between the Council and the Parliament. Evelina Gudzinskaite is director of the Migration Department at the Lithuanian Ministry of the Interior. She's been at the ministry for almost 10 years and has direct experience in dealing with coercion through migration. We will start with a presentation of the main arguments of the paper by Vladimír Šimoniák. Vlado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, online and here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I particularly appreciate Wilfried Martin Center for giving me this opportunity. Now, if I may then, to just highlight a few points that led me to even write this paper, to be honest. The main point was a stark difference between what I saw between the debate in Europe on weaponized migration and debate in the United States, Canada, Australia is a bit of an outlier there, but particularly those two countries. And I noticed that the specific sense of vulnerability is something that we only experience in Europe. The Americans, on several occasions, told me that they see no reason to even think about whether migration is weaponized by someone intentionally against their borders or not. I mean, they just simply did not feel that was a relevant element. And that made me think, you know, is there a specific vulnerability that we have in Europe? Is this just an illusion? Is it just a political trauma that we are experiencing from, I don't know, 2015 or maybe earlier events? Why is it that Europe is processing its perception of migration using a concept like weaponization or instrumentalization, if I'm to refer to the legislative work ongoing? And then, obviously, the EU became the first major jurisdiction in the world to actually process a legislative proposal on how to tackle specifically weaponized migration. And that obviously provided much more material to analyze, to think about. And I have myself had the direct experience of the processes in Brussels between 2015 and 21. I was at the Slovak Prem Rep, responsible for migration, so I had a first-hand experience of how the political debate was ongoing. In all the different situations that now we refer to as situations of weaponized migration. So these were the main things that led me to think about things that then resulted in this paper that you're having. And the main, I wouldn't call it findings, main opinions that I arrived to while writing this paper was that I do believe that Europe has a certain specific vulnerability to this kind of phenomenon. We are living in a difficult neighborhood. The EU is in the middle of a series of countries that don't really have unproblematic relations with us, with the EU. And some of the things that we do in migration management actually do serve as incentives to the leaderships of those countries to use migration as a weapon. It has been shown time and again. There were the actions by Turkey in 2020, in March. We are now seeing a repeated attempt, I think, by Russia, isn't it, to use migration against the Finnish border. We've already seen such attempts in the past. And all of these things provide also a comparative framework for us to look what worked and what didn't. And also in the context of the legislative work ongoing, what is likely to work in the future. When it comes to the legislative work, well, quite obviously, all of us in here are familiar with the institutional instincts of the European Commission. If there is a situation that requires a policy response, then it's quite likely that the European Commission is going to come up with a proposal to regulate that response, which is what we are having on the table right now. Now, I do not honestly believe that this the proposal of the Commission aims at a result that's completely realistic politically. If you look at the situation described in the legislative proposal, it refers to a situation of such serious threat to the most fundamental interests of a member state that I do not honestly see political readers limiting their freedom of action because there is a piece of legislation foreseeing that. I believe this is really the implicit weak spot of an attempt to regulate the response from the European level. And I do believe also that a certain degree of opacity, a certain degree of unpredictability of European response is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It is something that influences the decision-making on the other side. I was trying to analyze analyze is probably a too strong word. I was trying to imagine what kind of thinking is involved in the processes that lead certain neighbors, certain external actors to use migration as a tool against the EU. And I do believe that not being predictable from the European side is really something that serves as an implicit deterrent from using this instrument of pressure. I might be leaving it here.
Okay.
And obviously looking forward to debate.
Thank you, Vladimir. I just have one follow-up question. So obviously you're not arguing that other jurisdictions outside Europe are not subject to weaponized migration. What you're arguing is that the response is unique in the European Union, right?
That's my finding, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Lena, you've had the honor to be a shadow rapporteur for this piece of legislation in the Parliament. What is your response to the main argument? Also having worked on the file, how do you see it?
Well, actually, if you allow, also picking up a bit on the points that you just mentioned, going back a bit into the, let's say, the history of instrumentalization, because I would say it rather started already in 2019, and then had his first peak, I would say, between Turkey and Greece in 2020, with all the hiccups and follow-ups it also had, for example, for our own European agencies there, with a big question, of course, on how to protect border and at the same time follow the acquis of the European Union, which is at the very heart of the whole debate. If I may pick up on your main findings, and I very much welcome the study and also the contribution to the discussion, because when you see, when you look at it from the Parliament's point of view, from a legislative point of view, you see that there are actually very different reasons of hindrance in going forward with the proposals. For the time being, we had, I guess if I remember correctly, one shadow meeting only in the House, where we actually say that the majority of the shadow rapporteurs requested a further impact assessment on specific questions related to the argument. The rapporteur itself is not really interested in going forward, but for other reasons than probably the ones that you mentioned there. So we have this interinstitutional game here, and also the political game, of course, within the House. So when I look at the proposal, I do see a good point in your argument that being less predictable might help facing the situation of instrumentalization or even weaponization. I think it's not something that a legislator then should go out, say publicly, that we don't want to regulate something because it's against the very nature, as you also said, when it comes to the Commission. So having a discussion on that and having a text on the table is a good thing, I would say. But there are reasons why we're not advancing, and one of them is probably the thing that you mentioned. The other thing is that not everyone in the European Union has arrived yet at the perception that actually we do have instrumentalized migration. We see that it's certainly not true for the EPP and the group in the House, but we see that in other groups in the Parliament, that they really neglect the very core of an instrumentalized migration. And I think this is already a starting point for, of course, causing problems and delays within the Parliament. We see that the very idea of addressing instrumentalization migration is not only in this specific legislative act, but it's also a bit of it is in the Schengen Border Code reform, a bit of it is in the crisis regulation. So it comes up again and again and again. So I think even if the specific legislative proposal itself will not pass through, and to be honest, I'm not optimistic that it will do, at least not in this term. Then it doesn't mean that let's say, the whole concept of addressing it, which means also to a certain extent accepting that there is instrumentalized and weaponized migration. And I would say there is even more to come in the next weeks and months. At least we should be prepared for that. You've talked about Finland. I mean, I was in Lithuania and Latvia last year with a parliament's delegation, where you can clearly see, let's say, the clash of ideas between those who are really coming from the, let's say, humanitarian aspect, coming from quite secure countries because they don't have the experiences of your neighbors, just basically like that. So geographic position has a lot to do with your position on instrumentalization. And then we had, of course, the representatives, me being one of it from the EPP, really saying, well, of course it is a security issue. It doesn't mean that the people itself are a security issue, but the concept behind it is, and there we need to be better prepared than we are today. To my understanding, what the Commission tried with the proposal itself was a kind of, at least also what they're telling us with the proposal, is kind of safeguarding the right to asylum. And this is, I would say, the really tricky point in the whole discussion, especially starting with accepting that there is instrumentalization, but then going, of course, forward to the underlying question of how to address effective border management with the question of non-refoulement. And I think this is something that we really can't solve with just one single aspect, but it needs to be addressed in a broader context. So if you allow for a kind of conclusion or concluding remarks on behalf of the Parliament, I would say that the discussion itself helped. Your paper really helped in triggering the discussion itself, but not everyone in the House has arrived at the perception that there is instrumentalized migration, that we actually need to address it.
Interesting, thank you. Evelina, what is your response to the paper? And maybe you have something to add from your experience at the Ministry.
Thank you. Yes, it was very interesting to read the paper because I just was nodding and nodding and nodding, and what you are saying, it's also nodding and nodding. So I don't want to repeat what was already said, but out of this paper, two ideas struck me most. I mean, I would highlight two ideas that I would like to talk about. So the first one is exactly behind every instrumentalized migration, there is someone who organizes it, and they have some purpose. What do they want? So it's very easy when they want money. So you just give money and the migration stops. The migrant influx stops. But in case of Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Belarus, it was not about money. It was about political message and actually about promoting Kremlin's propaganda. That I would say one message was, okay, let's flood them with migrants and see how the European democracy works. Because it's those who follow the debates in there, they're always about how weak Europe is. The Europe is stupid, weak, old. This stupid democracy doesn't work. Only strong leader can put order. And I think Europe succeeded to show no. Even with our very complex decision making and very heavy mechanisms of democracy, we managed. And actually what the response of the EU institutions and other member states was very quick. That was very, very surprising in a good way. And I would say another political message is, okay, you, Europe, with your human rights, you are so hypocritical. So you say you defend human rights, but when there are all those poor people coming, so how do you defend human rights? By not providing right to asylum. So they are really taking those painful topics we are discussing and using against us. So that was obvious. So this is one point. What did they want? They want, well, no one knows what they actually want, but what I see and I would say what they wanted is to show, to strengthen the propaganda of Kremlin about Europe, which is constantly being flooded there, and to destabilize, to put chaos in our countries, to always to divide. And I think they didn't manage. And the other second point from the paper is, yes, I very much agree with the conclusion that the measures that Europe has, they must be, well, secret. I mean, they don't have to be predictable. Exactly what happened in our case, the same hybrid attack, you could see they were studying EU law. They did a very good homework because they studied, they knew how the procedures work, and they were using that against us. Migrants, they came from countries, each of them, they received their own stories. Okay, Europe grants asylum to people from that country who claim that they are such and that, and from that country who claim that they are such and that, and they all came with written stories. I am from this country, such and that. I am from that country, such and that. And it was sometimes even so ridiculous because I was also going to migrant camps and following interviews. Some even came with, I don't know how it's in English said, their stories written on their palms so that they don't forget what to say. Second thing, yes, destroy passports. And they knew that it's impossible to return. It's hard to return to Iraq, so the majority of migrants, at least in our case, was from Iraq. So they were using everything against us. So country of origin information and all the papers that we publish, they study. And they study very well. They have very good brain. And they are very cynical in using it against us. So maybe I will stop here.
Maybe
go ahead.
Just shortly,
Yeah.
because it very much follows what you just said. And this is something I would say also of importance for the discussion here in the House, because at the very first beginning, you're right, the institutions really had a strong message. So it was a case with Greece and Turkey, it was a case with Poland, Belarus, the Belarusian case. But time is of essence as a first reaction, which was very strong. But then you could see in the aftermath that, to a certain extent, the public discussion within the European Union shifted away from the strong messages of this is a security issue, which it still is. So we really need to be careful also about that, because what follows up was the Parliament's discussion, then refocusing again with a high level of priority on the question of access to asylum. So the first message was good, but the message that followed after that were problematic. And this is also a bit feeding into what you just said. It's not a singular point in time, but it needs to be treated over a long, long period of time with all the consequences it also has for the political discussion.
Talking about asylum, I want to ask you, Evelina, it's the one follow-up question. Lithuania was the first country to be targeted back in 2021 by Lukashenko's regime. I guess we don't know why that was, but Lithuanian response was varied. First, in the first weeks, I think starting in May, June, July, the government was processing asylum applications. Then it imposed a shorter processing time, maybe 10 days or something like that, and then it stopped processing the asylum applications. What, I guess, as the numbers were going up, that's my theory. Could you explain how the dynamic was?
Well, I would like to correct you. It didn't stop processing. It continued, but it got stuck with processing. That's the thing. Yeah, at the beginning, we had transposed EU acquis to our law, and we were using our national law, which is adjusted to the EU acquis, and then very quickly we saw it doesn't work. Well, the framework we used to have, it doesn't work because we keep coming and coming. They started trying by 1-2 persons, then okay, you accept them. Get some 10s. Oh, you accepted, so okay, here's 100. What will you do about that? So they were testing us. And then, of course, we realized that, EU law doesn't have norms for such force majeure situations. It doesn't have, but what to do? And of course the society was very clear, we are under attack, do something about that. Don't sit and be stupid about, that was the realization was very harsh. And then we said, yes, it's force majeure, let's do all we can to speed up the procedures. So we have a certain procedure which is, we don't call it border procedure, but it was, you can, in EU legislation, you can call it the border procedure. We started applying it, but obviously we didn't have enough capacities. That was the problem. And of course, we received a lot of support from the EU, which again, I'm really grateful about the response, the level of response. But then again, it's national procedures, national language, and we got stuck. We didn't have enough experts. So we had to recruit. Before the crisis, we had 8 people working with asylum cases. So suddenly, I was there, responsible for that. I get permission to hire 56 people. Okay, I hire them, but how to train them according to the very high EU standards? That's where we got stuck. But of course, we examined and then on, but of course, we were criticized for being too slow. Just to mention that in those days, our border procedure was 10 working days, which is impossible.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting insight. Obviously, this is a textbook example of weaponized migration overwhelmed the capacity of the receiving member state. Vladimir, do you have any response to any reaction to what was mentioned so far?
I think just maybe one reflection on the specific Lithuanian situation. I mean, a lot of the writing on weaponized migration seems to be working on the seems to be based on the assumption that it is a game of incentives and outcomes. Particularly, Kathleen Greenhill has been, very frequently processing examples of weaponized migration in analyzing, what kind of behavior those who engage in weaponized migration want to achieve. But I think the Lukashenko regime has shown very clearly that this is not sufficient. I mean, in some cases, yes, you have people who want to extract something specific, you want to achieve a certain objective by weaponizing migration, but Lukashenko is an example of just wanting to damage the neighboring country. I don't think there was any discernible objective that he wanted to achieve. There wasn't any wide negotiating framework within which he wanted to exercise pressure or increase pressure on Lithuania. This was just a purely hostile act for the sake of hostility, which is also something that needs to be, I think, factored in, because then we are completely outside of the scope of diplomacy. If, you know, I remember the situation in 2021. I think it was in November when Lukashenko had declared the French ambassador persona non grata. Okay? And France, in addition to being France, you know, was the incoming presidency of the EU. So if you kick out the French ambassador, then what kind of diplomacy do you want to engage in? You know, so this was taking place outside of the framework of interstate relations, even.
Interesting. I'll open the floor to your questions in a second. Just one last maybe question to you, our panelists. It's slightly outside of what we've been talking about so far, but there's this development in Tunisia where the EU seems to be lacking the tools to stem the migration from the Tunisian coast to Lampedusa. In your opinion, we don't have complete information, but in your opinion, is President Said engaging in instrumentalizing migration? Or is it just the case that we simply don't know?
Well, if you allow me to go first, I would say you made a very important differentiation in your, let's say, applying the concept of instrumentalization. So there might be instrumentalization where actually you do have a concrete interest, and there is instrumentalization, and this is what I had in mind when I said that the Parliament, specifically the Parliament, is not ready yet to acknowledge that, is that there is a further use of instrumentalization as a kind of part of hybrid warfare. And the only incentive there is to create unrest, being hostile, being unpredictable to a certain extent, but also creating unrest in the neighboring countries and in the European Union as a whole, which is why it was so important that at the very beginning, all three institutions made a really strong message, also geopolitically, to the outside world, that this is not a case where Europe will step back on Chris. But of course, again, coming back a bit to the point I made on the importance of time and timing here, after all, we still have the discussion within the European Union. And I think that we really need to find, let's say, the right balance between being unpredictable to the outside, but being predictable as possible to the inside of the European Union. Meaning that if one is attacked, everyone is attacked. But also meaning that when it comes to the migration itself, that member states need to rely on each other. They need to trust each other. And this is something where we actually have a huge task also ahead of us in the broader context of migration. But of course, instrumentalization being a part of that.
Okay. Is President Said engaging in instrumentalization? What do you think? We don't know.
Well, it's political thing, and it was also a nice part in the documents where sometimes it's hard to say if when country is not able to control the situation in this country, can you blame them for instrumentalizing? So I think it's a very good point that you should always bear in mind.
Lack of capacity. Okay, some hands were raised. The lady in the second row, and then Tana in the first row.
Yes, thank you very. Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. If you allow me 2 comments, I rarely think it's only a case for money. It's usually and generally what we see, it's a weaponization. The issue is very complex. There is no simple answer to that. But the weaponization initially comes from hostile countries, but allow me to say that their way of thinking is also repeated by leftists. And it becomes now, before the European elections, they become objective allies of the extreme right, because by putting in difficult situation democratic governments, they push forward extremist parties. And who are their objective allies? NGOs. If we don't deal with the NGOs who have a lucrative commerce, who are in contact with smugglers, before the European elections, we will have a huge problem with public who will vote for extremist parties to be protected. So I am not sure that we can wait till the next parliament to find a solution. I think that is an issue to be tackled before the European elections. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a comment rather than a question, but maybe somebody on the panel will respond. Please, Tom.
Yeah, well, hello, I'm Tomi Huhtanen, Executive Director of Mate Center. I have a very practical, question. Just a step back, so to get to the, to the real picture. So for Evelina Kutsinkaite, you were referring, you had to face practical situations. So what's the picture, especially as we now, I'm also Finn, and so what are the lessons learned? So how tricky got the situation in Lithuania? Number one, and number two, what are lessons learned in terms of, let's say that we have for example, Russia is testing, let's say, not hundreds, but we start to see thousands. And thirdly, like a fellow Finns, what would be your advice? How to approach, like, 4 or 5 point action model? What would you say? Because those, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, it's a very practical problem where you have to find very clear answers. It's not academic exercise, as you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. There's a third question there in the second row. The gentleman there, the glasses.
Thanks very much. It's Tony Gillen from MCC Brussels. Vladimir, thank you for your report. I've got one straightforward question and one more difficult question, if I may. So the relatively straightforward question is, could you give me a ballpark estimate of the proportion of migration that is weaponized, if you like, versus the proportion that is not being weaponized? So just a rough idea of your estimate. And then I just wanted to refer to Vladimir's report, and a key part of it, which you sort of skated over a little bit, I think. On page 5, Vladimir, you make the point that the EU is a community of law, and as Europeans, we conceptualize society as an environment of the law, and coercive migration exploits that European attitude. So I guess I would just like to hear your thoughts about that and how we can avoid it being exploited. And so do we need to re-look at what the criteria for being an asylum seeker? Is this something we need to take much more seriously? Because we are currently being exploited.
So I will take further questions after this. I see more hands. Hopefully we'll have the time for you. I'm sure we will. So 3 questions right now. The role of the political left and NGOs first. Secondly, advice to the Finnish government. And thirdly, what proportion of migration is instrumentalized? And do we need to revisit the definition of asylum? Whoever wants to go first. And you don't have to all respond to all the questions. You can pick and choose. Vladimir?
Thank you. Well, on the comments of leftists and NGOs, I mean, I'm a nominee of a social democratic party in my current job, so probably I should now engage in some sort of protest, but I'm not going to. In general terms, if someone's engaging in a hostile or criminal action, it shouldn't really matter whether it's an NGO or not. I mean, if you start dealing drugs as an NGO, then that NGO becomes a criminal organization. So I think the distinction between whether or not something is an NGO, a commercial operation, or whatever else should not really matter. It does, though, practically, and it's something that I consider to be a problem. If there is someone smuggling people across the border under the disguise of an NGO, then we are facing a problem, and I don't think that's an unheard of situation at the external borders. When it comes to the ballpark estimate, I believe that it is actually quite specific to a situation of weaponized migration, that in most situations you do not have weaponized migrants as being part of asylum seeker flow or other arrivals. But a situation of weaponization is very characteristic by suddenly seeing 100% of people coming being really instruments of a hostile actor. You have seen that at the Moroccan-Spanish land border in Ceuta and Melilla. You have seen it in, at the Turkish-Greek border. I think you can also confirm it from the experience of Lithuania, which are, these borders are exposed to some sort of ordinary migration events, and then all of a sudden, it all changes. Then all of a sudden, it's so. It would be probably possible to make some sort of statistics to address your question, but I don't think it's really worthwhile going there because, if that situation, when and where that situation occurs, basically everybody appearing at the border are people being cynically used as instruments of pressure. And whether or not it's law being exploited, yes, I think that's actually a rather crucial element that you identified. At least in my perception, this is something that's quite important. Maybe I could go back to something that Lena has said, that we should be unpredictable to the outside, predictable from the inside. Well, is legislation the right way? Because to be honest with you, I have myself had the experience of every Home Affairs Council between 2010 and 2021. And there had been different meetings with different content. But I remember specifically the meeting on the 1st of March 2020, where it was an extraordinary council meeting that was convened to address the situation then evolving at the Greek-Turkish border. And I do remember that date because everything worked perfectly. I have to be honest with you, everything worked as they should. The input of the agencies was exactly the way it had been anticipated, the way it should be. The unanimity in the council was complete. I honestly don't remember many other instances of unanimity in the council. And as a result, the situation at the Greek-Turkish border was over, basically within 5 days, if I remember correctly. So, and I do believe that this is an example of best practice. It was a purely political process. It was something agreed by ambassadors in Coreper, then agreed again and implemented by ministers in the council. And no piece of legislation was involved. I know that it doesn't make the parliament happy. I know it doesn't make the commission too happy, But it was actually an example of something that worked. And it worked without a single piece of legislation being involved. Which brings me back to the thesis that you identified in the paper. Yes, as Europeans, we do conceptualize our society as a society of law. But sometimes staying within the framework of law, obviously, maybe not too much detail on the procedure of political action could be more useful than not.
Response to this, and plus we have the further questions. Who wants to? Lena, you want to go ahead?
If you're also allowed to pick up your last point, I think, I'm a member of this house, I'm a proud member of this house, and everyone knows who has to deal with a house that it's actually also a proud institution, with sometimes not the right balance between being proud and being quite childish from time to time. But I would say my personal answer to your question also, to your point, whether it always needs to be a legislative proposal that is the answer. I think it's a mixture of both. So we need to have very fast instruments, very fast reaction mechanisms in the Council, in coordination maybe with the Commission. But on the other hand, it's also important that we show to the outside world that we are able to deal with instrumentalization without becoming unlawful. So it also needs a bit of whether we exactly then find the right spot of addressing a specific kind of instrumentalization. I think that can be left open. But we need to have an instrument at hand in order to conceptualize things as much as possible without leaving or disclosing the room for member states to react. And I think this is something probably the kind of balance between the two positions here, that we can and we should set standards for the situation where we are faced with instrumentalized or even weaponized migration, but we should leave leeway to the member states in how to react to that. And I think this could probably be then the kind of squaring the circle here, especially when it comes to the, let's say, the toolbox that member states can use and should use. The question of let's say, the composition or the proportion of instrumentalized migration. I think the very essence of instrumentalization is that it has nothing to do with numbers itself, but with the peak of numbers. And with the, let's say, the mixing of regular asylum seekers and those who are really being shipped, transported, or in any kind of way, in a very organized way to a specific part of the border. And I mean, we were at the border. It's not like you're arriving there by accident. It will take you, if you go by foot, it will take you days to go there if you're not transported with specific measures. So there's also the link to, and this is, I think it was in the case of Poland and Belarusian case, that actually transport, the airlines had a huge impact on the salvation of the problem in the end, in a very short time. So also their responsibility is a bit of a part of instrumentalization. And the question at what point you're kind of overwhelmed with your national asylum system differs a lot from member state to member state. I remember one of your colleagues saying that indeed we are faced with like 40 asylum application a year, and now it's 40 a night. This is, of course, compared to what Greece is facing, a relatively small number. But being faced with that, it of course means that you are kind of overwhelmed in your national system. And this is, I would say, the more important part of let's say, the proportion question there. And that to the question of NGOs and the left being, let's say, the friends of some narratives that are going around here in the European Union. Yes, it is. You can see that in the Parliament's discussion as well. The very question of whether we accept instrumentalization as a concept or not is highly political in the House. I just mentioned it in my introductory words. And of course, the very question of on how to, or where to put the emphasis on in the European answer is of course also highly political. And when it comes to the transparency, I mean, there is a new report being requested by the EPP in the Budget Committee. It should be Budget, not Cont, but it's requested by also one German colleague, where we actually ask for more transparency for NGOs, especially if there's European funding in there. Of course it needs to be, because we need to make sure that European money really serves the purpose of the European Union and not probably against it. And you're probably also familiar with the work of the European Parliament at specific request also from the EPP on, let's say, malicious third country influence on political decision making, which is an even broader topic to dive into, but of course needs to be addressed as well. Specifically when you look at one small subcommittee of the European Parliament who is, I would say, right in the middle still of a scandal when it comes to third-party influence in decision-making.
Yeah, you're referring to Qatargate, I suppose, and all that followed. Thank you. Evelina, maybe the lessons for other governments from Lithuanian experience?
I would like to begin with one idea of Madame Dupont, who said about sensibilization when it comes to both to fighting those NGOs or those candidates financed by foreign powers, or also by preparing for a possible aggression, hybrid attack. It's a sensibilization of the society, so that society is aware what is true, what is false. That society is aware this is propaganda, this is not. When there's some message, there has to be think tank or experts or whatever, or journalists saying this is not true and this is how it works. Educating society to distinguish between propaganda and not propaganda. This is very important. And in Lithuania, this job has been done for many years, and people, I would say, they are quite strong in distinguishing who is who. So just this work needs to be continued. And then about what to do, well, first of all, build the fence. Build fence and prepare operational plans and try them in some practical way. This is a theory, but we also had an operational plan. But when the attack started, this plan didn't work at all. So we had to build a new plan by fighting the actual crisis. But then once we did it, we made it quite vague again, not by strict rules, but quite vague, which allowed us to use the same plan, a little bit modified, but for accepting Ukrainian war refugees. So you once do it, then you practice for different sorts of crises. And also building this operational plan, it also includes having very fast public procurement procedures, very fast recruitment procedures, so that all the public sector can breathe, shrink and expand. How this migration influx grows, you must be very, very fast in expanding all that is needed to accept that. So this is really practical things which have to be done with sensibilization of everyone. Yes, and very much, you can never be too much supportive for the idea that the EU legislation or national legislation has to have a framework, but not the concrete rules, because every crisis is different. Every crisis has different actors, and if you want to be efficient, you must always improvise, always.
Thank you. Interesting. Vlado? Well.
Just one remark on, possible toolbox for governments being faced with such situations. I think there is one element that consistently has been shown by experience to work, or being part of a successful mix. I do agree with that each situation is a bit of a bit different from all the others, but I think that keeping the response close to the border is an important part of the mix. In the Finnish situation, I remember I was actually at the Finnish-Russian border, close to Lappeenranta. And it's a beautiful landscape, but I doubt that most of the people arriving, aim to stay there. And whenever the pressure has been allowed to go further inland, the situation wasn't solved successfully from anyone's perspective. So I think it's quite critical to simply stick to the border, to conduct all the procedures as border procedures. And that, I think, from my experience, has been, from what I've seen and from what I remember, is an important element of any response.
Thank you. We can ask some more questions, maybe two. I think we have 7 minutes left. The lady there in the third row.
Hello, Marita Metzelopoulou from EPRS. Maybe since the impact assessment is going to be discussed in Libe next week, in 2 weeks' time, do you think that we are directing ourselves into overlapping regulations or into over-regulating? Or what do you think the future will be of the instrumentalization as a file? Since there is also now the crisis proposal and force majeure, what will it be at the end? It will be instrumentalization, it will be a bit mentioned everywhere.
Okay, one more question if there is one. I think I saw somebody, but if you're the lady there, yep.
Hello, Inga Nicholas. So I would like to take under the gentleman in front of me about the need to change the criteria of who's entitled to asylum. As we go beyond the Refugee Convention and Human Rights Convention already. And this pull factor forces frontline countries to go beyond and around the reception rules. For instance, Malta, that by default puts people into detention for up to 18 months and carries on. And I know this doesn't sound very nice, but it does work wonders. They've been criticized by institutions and organizations, but they have ignored it, both the Nationalist Party and the Labour Party. And it's worked to make it much less attractive. And I think that unless the criteria is changed, then more frontline countries are going to be forced to do exactly the same as Malta, and thereby do the uncodified response, as the paper states.
All right, thank you. So, comment. Let's get back to that question now that was asked about the future of this particular file. Lena, you are the best person to address that.
Well, I would say that maybe I start with that. There's a specific reason why it pops up in different legislative acts, because in Schengen Border Code, it's a different notion, it's a different situation, but still we try to, let's say, address the lessons learned from the cases we've just been experiencing. In crisis, it's the same. And I'm now dividing my answer probably in two parts, the realistic one and what I would want it to have. In the sense of what we actually just discussed, having a framework, but giving member states flexibility, I would say it's still, I would still wish for having this kind of legislation, because it's actually part of the toolbox that we need in the overall context of the asylum and migration policy. So without the proposal, I think we left out a piece in a conclusive framework of a European asylum and migration policy. But that doesn't mean that we should not address and work around the very concept of instrumentalization in the other files as well. So, and here comes the realistic part. I do want to have it all. Politically, I think we should concentrate on having the pieces and bits within the legislation and within the discussion of the pact, and move forward with the instrumentalization as such probably in the next term. Because what I see now for the time being is that the rapporteur has not really an interest in moving forward. I think he's now covered with different aspects of internal policies in Poland. The majority of the shadow rapporteurs basically has no interest to move forward because they want to destroy the concept, and using the impact assessment as a kind of tool for that, which leaves the EPP, let's say, the only one in the room who really wants to work around the concept as such. So I'm not that optimistic, especially not for this term. But it doesn't mean that we should, for good reasons, then focus on the things we can achieve in the other files, because also there it is an important role to play for instrumentalization, or being better prepared against those threats.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That was quite clear. We don't have time for any more questions. Any last remarks from the panel? Any concluding points? Anybody?
I'd like to just thank everybody attending. I appreciated you dedicated the time to switch in remotely, or to be here in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, our audience here and online. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at next Martin Center event. Thanks.